Hi, everybody. We're at the home stretch. Thanks for coming to my talk. I've been enjoying this conference so much. It's always nice to meet people that are facing kind of similar problems and having like the very similar conversations that you're always kind of like, oh, I wish I had somebody else to talk to about. So anyway, today I would love to talk with you guys about this concept of like operations and who owns it. And I really fundamentally believe discussing this topic is crucial to even the next steps of like implementing LFI or implementing SRE or all these other things. So firstly, just a little bit about me. I am a SRE manager at Arista Networks. We have more recently launched a SaaS product, so we kind of went through this honestly very, very exciting organizational journey, like very big culture shifts to kind of move to that SaaS model and what that really means. Today, of course, I am coming from an SRE perspective when I talk about operations, and we get to talk about some of my favorite topics like organizations, teams, feedback loops, and how they all kind of mesh together. To jump right in, so if you were to ask different people, teams, and all the people that kind of make up your organization today, this question of who owns operations, what would they say? Would they kind of be like, huh, why are you asking me this question? All the way to, what are you asking me? To maybe like a lot of different answers, or maybe you guys already have an answer. That's great. We can just skip to the end of the talk, right? But like, I am coming from a perspective of chances are you're going to get quite a different answers depending also on who you're asking, who you're talking to. Who owns operations? Obviously, very short question, but also very complex subject, right? So if you were to break this down into kind of what are the specific questions we can really ask, it's really asking like who are the people involved in operations, who are the different teams, so like that kind of people topology that you're looking at. What is operations? Sort of existential question, but like what does operation mean for you and your organization and the product that you guys are building, right? And it does matter and differs per organization. When does operations matter? So like where in that software development cycle, all the way to delivery, where does operations come into picture? Maybe the answer is all of the steps, or maybe some of it. Again, kind of depends on your setup. We kind of touched on the when part already. Where does operations matter? Where in the teams, as well as again, software development cycle, as well as delivery to production and all that. Why does it matter? And that, I think, is a very interesting question and can be very, very deep. Like, why do we want to talk about operations? Why does it matter in software, right? And how is software in operation managed and maintained with respect to your organization? So again, like, I think we went from kind of like, what is operations to seemingly kind of like a breakdown, almost like existential questions for your organization. And then like, what's the next thing we do? It's like, all right, well, I don't have answers yet. So what's the first thing I'm going to do? Google it. And then you kind of realize, oh yeah, operations management, like this is a topic that is not new. It has been discussed in many different industries. Like software world did not develop this. But then you're like, okay, I'm doing all this future research, I'm reading it, great, I'm learning about the history. I still have no idea what this means for me and my organization, right? So you're like, okay, let me then take a step back and look at some of how does software world try to approach these questions, right? So that's kind of where you kind of look at the different paradigms, like DevOps practices, SRE comes in the picture, LFI, incident management, like you have all the variations in between. Maybe you're along the journey to adopting some of them, or maybe already very mature along that journey. Of course, best fit, you can determine that for your organization, right? But the main point I'm making here is there's lots of approaches, lots of definitions to what operations can mean. And it does matter a lot how we define it for your organization. So we kind of talked a lot about operations, but like, okay, operations around what? And we definitely looked at one of the what categories before, right? And it is imperative to talk about operations around obviously the kind of culture around incidents. How do we do incident management? How does operations fit into that picture? So again, I would definitely try to approach this in a breakdown questions such as asking the different people in your organization, if you have an incident, who will be responding to that incident? that is an operations question, actually. Who are the people we're managing? How are you communicating between teams? And obviously, it just doesn't have to be restricted to like when things go boom on production, right? It could be, again, actually, we're kind of skipping to the where section. Where does incidents happen? Is it just production, pre-production, different types of production regions? And who will be responding to that? Again, they're all kind of very connected questions. We kind of went over what is incident already. When do different teams get involved, right? So there's more operations-focused teams, and there's slightly less operations-focused teams. There's a lot of variations in between. And there's obviously the how. How do you define what is an incident in your organization? How do different groups get involved? Again, going to that communication question. So if there was a lot of kind of breakdown there, and if you and your organization already has very clear answers and expectations around these questions, great, right? But to have those kinds of shared understanding, you have to have these discussions, right? And what happens if you just never get a chance to talk about them and never get a chance to kind of come to an agreement, right? And there's also, I think operations can get very complex subject, as there can be some misunderstandings, preconceptions, biases, different kinds of standards, expectations, depending on what kind of background you're coming from. Which is also why, again, having these discussions and especially not having them can be very, very costly, right? And we really love talking about how to build this cool new feature and how to get it shipped, and then what are different backends we're going to use and languages and doing comparisons like that. I would say all of those conversations are amazing. When do we talk about operations in that picture? Is that part of your design process? I would definitely argue it should be part of the design process, right? How do you respond to when that shiny new thing that you just shipped, when things go wrong with it, right? So I would just definitely say we just don't talk about this in general. I know my organization definitely did not, and we've definitely something that we've culturally and together as an organization had to improve on. And yeah, this is about culture setting, right? Operations inherently is a significant portion of the culture of your organization. And how you define it, all the kind of questions we just looked at, and pushing and then having that understanding across different people needs very intentional organization direction and push so that everybody agrees on what it means, right? And when I say ownership, which ownership also can be defined in many different ways, when I say ownership, I'm especially in this talk, I am really referring to operations and what happens in production. And here, production really in deployment circumstances that you really care about and it has customer impact. Shared understanding of incident management and ownership. So again, operations question. Shared expectation of what to do when things go boom. So when incidents happen, and however you want to define them. It can even be in pre-production or staging environments. When things go wrong in even staging, what are your expectations? What's going to happen? Who's going to respond, right? And as we have this kind of shared conversations across many different teams, this does not negate the need for kind of operations and productions-focused teams, right? And these are kind of your SRE teams, your DevOps teams. Folks are hands deep in those kinds of worlds. I mean, you eventually need a division of labor. That's a good thing, right? There's development teams because they're really good at building things, and there's SRE teams that have to think about the reliability, how things are being deployed, and lots of other things, right? But this cultural understanding and coming to an agreement kind of manages those relationships between teams that can be potentially very disparate, right? So what can happen when we don't discuss this enough? Or more definitively, what can happen when there is no cultural shared understanding around operations and set expectations? Incident management starts getting really, really hard. It really does feel like playing kind of like a Jenga tower, right? Every incident is almost like taking out a little block, and it kind of gets a little bit shakier and shakier, and it gets a little bit harder to put that back in, right? And what's I think interesting is it kind of comes to a point where like you're already kind of in knee-deep trying to deal with incidents, but the whole management part of it and coordination part gets hard. So that part, incident management itself gets really difficult, even before talking about the actual incident and what we're going to do about it. And so there's many reasons to kind of be in this kind of position or part of your journey. And it might not necessarily just be because you haven't had the chance to have these discussions, right? There are other fundamental kind of preconceptions or other blockers that has to do around operations that I genuinely think can contribute to this kind of incident management becoming really, really difficult. One of the blockers I would definitely say is like operations and operations management is definitely not something I've seen very common across like computer science programs. In fact, I don't think, I would love to actually learn about them if there's one like traditional kind of university program that teaches about it. It's not fundamental like how to program in Python or like learning about operating systems or like different types of algorithms. So, but like that isn't the core issue. But the main core issue is that unlike these kind of other computer science core concepts that build a foundation around what to expect out of computer science in general, or coding, or looking at that approach, you kind of don't have that, right? A lot of, especially newer graduates out of schools, just are completely missing that picture, unless circumstantially we get lucky and they've had internships, in DevOps teams or SREs, where like they get that kind of that side of the picture, like what software in industry and out in the wild, and what that entails, right? This was slightly harder to manage, obviously, with your organization, but it can definitely contribute. Kind of the different way that is definitely can be managed and in your control is, kind of unintentional ways you might be creating these kinds of blockers around operational culture in your organization. It might be the way you deliver software, like CI/CD pipelines, maybe some access control, RBAC, maybe like developers don't have easy access to production environments. There's a lot of different well-intentioned tooling and setup that may unintentionally create these kind of mythical walls between environments and teams, right? And like I think this one's quite can be quite common. Like there's stuff happening in production, and developers are like, well, it's like whatever happens in production is a production problem, and then it's like, oh yeah, SRE teams or DevOps team will deal with that, right? So and then like obviously just saying break the mythical wall doesn't do it. We've actually had a lot of talks during the LFI conference that we talked about like don't just tell people what to do, show them how to do it, right? What we really need is that shared cultural understanding. So at the end of the day, not talking enough about the cultural understanding of operations can really hurt everybody, not just the kind of operations-focused teams, dev teams, the whole organization, the product, the customers. And it really can create dysfunctions between teams, the mythical wall we just saw, blame games. And I think one of the most damaging parts can be the broken feedback loop, right? There are things that operations can see that dev teams don't necessarily see immediately, right? Things that happen in certain production environments that like ops-focused teams have responded to, that feedback loop has to be complete with the dev team so that we create that whole system of how to fix it and not just patch Band-Aid fixing things, but looking at things as an architecture as a whole, right? And this can be managed with right culture setting and asking the right questions and having those discussions. So what are some of the things we can do? We already looked at kind of a lot of the questions, the leading kind of core probing questions you can have with different teams in your organization. But what are some of the other things in the toolbox that you can use? I'm from San Francisco, so I had to find a reason to put in a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. But kind of conceptually, how do we bring all these worlds together and build bridges? In my toolbox, at least, there's one set of tools that I consider to be part of evangelization. I mean, this was heavily implemented by my SRE team, especially to kind of bridge that gap of understanding our operations. Number one, seems very, very simple, but unless you actually say it, we don't actually get to do it, which is actively bringing all teams, including dev teams, ops teams, adjacent teams, any other analysis teams, into incident review together. So, I mean, that is a time commitment, though, right? So that there's a fine line of getting everybody in the room and talking about what happened. There is a cost to that you do need to plan for, but it is very, very valuable. It creates that kind of bridge between teams, and you can really start seeing how different teams view the same problem. Teach and share how production and software delivery works, if that is something that's relevant to your organization. State of production. This is something that, at least in my organization, we've started to do, which is like kind of sharing the stories of, actively sharing stories of what has been happening in production, what are some of the incidents, and actively talking about it pretty much in every weekly or even daily meetings around it. Having that be a very core conversation, right? Not just an afterthought, but something we talk about it even during design review. And also making sure that operations teams, dev teams have something that they can have a shared language around. And one of the best ways to do that, and this goes to Charity's book as well, observability, metrics, having that data, and data can be the core binding element to different teams that may not otherwise have a shared understanding or shared view of the world, right? Kind of other more dedicated tooling side of things, this can really depend on kind of your organization structure. Having that kind of core conversations around SLIs and SLOs, this goes back to the metrics that I was talking about, like having shared dashboards and shared SLIs, SLOs that every team can look at. So let's say SRE can look at alongside dev teams. Maybe even gating deployments or having CI/CD processes evolve around this shared metrics can be very, very helpful. Some automated frameworks around injecting libraries for, automated frameworks and libraries for injecting standard observability tools into code. So that's, again, to kind of try to lessen the burden on developers that may have to kind of collect metrics, traces, spans, all that, just to make that process a little bit easier. That's obviously building the bridge towards what we already talked about, which is having the shared metrics and SLIs and SLOs. Correctness testing to include a suite of metrics and metrics-based tests and validation. So this is kind of like, in your unit tests or end-to-end tests, not just having those tests, but also having the metrics and SLIs and SLOs be part of that conversation too. So this is, again, all different kinds of ways to bring in earlier in development and earlier in design, kind of, how do we view things when things have gone wrong? How are we going to actually look at what are the tools? And, almost like unintentionally very intentionally, but very subtly putting in the tools to be able to have that later on in the conversation. All right, so in summary, we kind of looked at a lot of things, but actively asking the question of who owns operations in your organization is very, very fundamental to having effective incident management. It is very difficult to, let's say, even adopt LFI model, or even, even before that kind of more traditional root cause analysis models. It's very difficult to even have that conversation when we don't agree on an operational model. And it's a very intentional culture setting, right? It's very difficult to do that with just kind of bottoms-up approach. It does need intentional leadership support as well, and setting that tone across many, many different teams in the organization. And then, as leaders in your organization, it is really critical to realize that these are very complex socio-technical kinds of systems that we're looking at, right? So, operations are about people, but it also has tooling in it. We kind of looked at the tooling side, the metric side, the data side. There's all of that too, but all of that needs to also work alongside the people that will be interacting with it, different teams that will be interacting with the same data. So it's a pretty complex picture that we're looking at, right? And not having the agreement that it's a very complex socio-technical system can give you very segregated views of the world that, eventually might not set the right culture tone. So that was my talk. Thank you. And for the questions the probing questions we just talked about, I do have a reference site. It is extremely wordy, but I've added in there for reference later as needed. And thank you. Oh, I lost it. Oh, I do have a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has thoughts. Great. Nope. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
So who owns the operations in your team and how did you find that?
Yeah, I mean, so it did start with SRE mostly driving the conversation. And we, even practically speaking, like pager holding was mostly owned by SRE. And it was a more of a practical choice at the beginning, just to kind of hit the ground running kind of operation. It doesn't scale, right? There's a lot of different applications. We have a lot of production regions. It is impossible to have just one team kind of trying to absorb all of that. But it was kind of born out of necessity. But it did involve very active conversations with all the different teams. So like the UI teams, the different application teams, back-end teams, to say, hey, we got to build a model where all of us have a shared understanding, right? The pager part or any of the alerts part, that's kind of the details, I would say, right? Those are the little details you can figure out very quickly. But it's more like, hey, dev team right there, do you understand what happened to the application that was in production that went boom? And just a lot of the times, they just might not, right? They might be like, well, I was too busy coding, which is a very legitimate response to these kinds of questions. And then you have to actively bring them in, and kind of that's why I also touch on the being able to add metrics and observability the easy part of their job, so it just lessens that kind of burden on the developers who, honestly have a lot to do already, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah.
So you talked about a good feedback loop.
Yes.
To have very effective ways to get better feedback successfully done.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
So do you have any recommendations on how to effectively do a feedback loop?
Number one is definitely what I mentioned here, which is a little bit costly, and that's why I want to put a little bit of caveat there. The actively including dev teams in incident reviews, like it needs to, like, especially if it's a more complex incident, or even the simplest ones, you need the right people engaged in the room, right? And you need them to kind of see why did this go boom, and they can get the live feedback from there, especially from people that have responded to it. Maybe also if there's other people on the team that haven't been part of that incident response team, have them also on board. It does take a lot of active engagement, and I really do think it's exponential payoff. Like the first few times you do it, because people aren't used to it, and they're like, well, that's a lot of time commitment, right? But once you start doing it, and people see the value, and people are like, oh, okay, that's the picture of the world. I finally put it all together. Then it really sets that tone. It gets them curious, right? The other feedback part is definitely just data, honestly. Data does a lot. Having that shared SLIs and SLOs, all agreed upon, different teams that need to look at it, 100% helps. And there's various other ways. I'm a little bit more, slightly more opinion on the sending alerts part, because I think it can be very, very slippery slope. But that's why I'm like, the pagers, alerts, like, that's the details. It's the data, once they can see what went wrong in production, SLIs, SLOs, and maybe if you're not ready to do that, just even bare bone metrics and dashboards to get there really does help to set the tone, and active engagement in incident reviews. Great, well, I'm right on time. So thank you so much for coming to my talk, and enjoy the rest of the conference.